Hello and welcome to today's edition of SCM Live. Is there slavery in your supply chain? My name is Kim Monroe, Marketing Manager at ASCM. And before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. And if you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call the GoToWebinar technical support at 1-805-617-7000. In addition, this presentation is being recorded today and it will be emailed to all registrants early next week. And we'll also include the presentation with the reference links in that email. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Rick Crandall currently serves as Professor of Management in the School of Business at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, a position he's held since 2003. His primary research interest is in the area of crisis management and helping organizations cope with catastrophic events. He co-authored the book Crisis Management: Leadership in the New Strategy Landscape with John Parnell and John Spillane of the University of North Carolina at Pembroke through Sage Publications. Now I'd like to welcome Rick. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for that introduction. And hello to everybody out there that's listening today. As you can see, the topic is slavery in your supply chain, and hopefully there'll be something interesting here that you can take back to your work with you. Now, assisting me in the research of some of this material is Richard Crandall, and you can see by the same last name, he is actually part of my family. He's my father. And Richard and I have done a number of research projects together, including supply chain issues as well as crisis management issues. So there's material in the presentation today that we worked on together and developed together. Richard also may be a familiar name to some of you. He writes the relevant research column in the magazine. So today, I have four goals I want to accomplish. First, I'm going to go over how slavery can get into the supply chain. Secondly, I'm going to understand why it's important to know what's going on beyond what we call Tier 1. And if you're not familiar with Tier 1, I think most of you are, but if this is new terminology, I'll explain that in just a minute. Third, we're going to overview strategies on how you can prevent slavery from entering your supply chain. And then finally, at the back, I've got some additional resources for you. And the resources will be part of your slides. I've included some links. So when you get your final set of slides, if you put your presentation in slideshow mode, those links should work for you. Now I'm going to begin with some background information about how slavery gets into the supply chain. And I've got a couple things I'm grouping together here, so it's a little bit haphazard, but hopefully you'll see how we need to understand this background information first. Now, when you hear estimates about slavery, first of all, you're going to get a couple of numbers. And one thing that you'll hear most of the time is we don't know the actual number, obviously, of slaves out there. And secondly, there's a grouping of people that are considered slave labor, and then there's the sexual market of slavery, And when you combine those two together, you often get a figure that's in excess of 40 million. Now, you see the figure I have here is 24.9, and again, that's a 2016 estimate, and we're primarily referring to just people that are working in our supply chain. So we're not talking about sex trafficking at this point. This is just what we would call forced labor. Now, the main industries that are affected by forced labor, and you're going to hear me say forced labor, modern slavery. I'm using these things interchangeably, and I'll get a little more specific with that in just a minute. But in terms of industries, we are looking at agriculture, some aspects of food processing, the fishing industry, and then we get into manufacturing of textiles, garments, and electronics, and of course, mining and domestic work. So pretty broad range. And even if you are an end producer and not involved in any of those industries, we have to consider that it's the components that go into our final products that are still part of the supply chain. Now, a little bit of history here. Originally in our country, most of the large companies were built on a vertical integration model. And some of you that may be a little older, like myself, might remember the Ford Motor Company is one that we always like to say, well, they were vertically integrated. They owned some of the steel production, the mines, and various sub-assemblies that went into their final product. So vertical integration, it's something we still teach a lot in our classrooms, but the reality today is that a lot of what is going on in manufacturing is a virtual structure, and we're using supply chains that stretch all over the world. So the ownership of our suppliers is not prevalent like it was during the vertical integration era, which dates back several decades ago. Little visual here as far as what we mean. Some have called this setup the virtual organization, and basically what we're saying is that a company retains what it does best, and we call that the core competency functions, and everything is run by upper level management, and then anything else is contracted out to other companies. So one of the first companies that we think of historically that adopted this model was Nike. And I often tell my students, remember, Nike does actually not make shoes. They develop shoes and they market shoes. And that's part of that core competency that they do well. But the making of the shoes, those occur at other locations, mostly outside of the country. And in most cases, Nike does not actually own the contractors, so they are independently owned and operated. Now, let's go right into the four conditions of what we mean by slavery, and I'm referring this to the context of a supply chain. So, number one, we got a worker that's controlled by the employer, but there is an element of mental or physical abuse. So there's a dehumanization process that's going on there. And of course, that leads to the second one, which sounds like it's restating the first one, but the idea is the worker is not really a human worker, but they're just another piece of machinery out there that just happens to be a person. So we might say they're treated like a commodity. Now, number three is pretty important. The worker's freedom of movement is restricted. And we're going to see in a minute that a lot of the victims of slavery are actually migrants who have been transported to another country. And once they are in that new location, their employer, whoever it may be, will restrict their movement by taking their visa or passport. So at that point, the new worker or the migrant has to stay very close to where they work, and often that's in some type of company housing. Now, the fourth thing is today's modern slavery is a forced labor model that's based on being an indentured servant. And what we mean is somewhere along the way, the worker accrued a debt, usually to a labor agent that got them the job, and then they are slowly supposed to be paying off that debt. And usually what happens is the debt is either their work is not applied to that debt at all, or they are taken advantage of severely. So I'll explain that in just a little bit more detail in a minute. Now, a little bit about, this is a little sidestep here, and it kind of goes along with this idea of, how do we move from vertical integration to worldwide supply chains? And if I could start at the top, consumers, and I'm using that term rather loosely, of course, but let's just say consumers in general, particularly in industries such as retail and discount retail industries, they get accustomed to buying their products at very good prices. So with that, we've got of course, the clothing industry, the appliance industry, the big box retailers. This is sort of the first step where consumers begin to price shop for what they're looking for. And add the new business model with Amazon, and we just see that price shopping intensified. Now, if we follow the arrow, that puts pressure on businesses, and as many of you know, to reduce your operating cost and your material cost. So the logical result of that is to outsource to less developed countries. Obviously, the labor is lower, and that means in terms of price per unit, you can source to other countries and get that product at a considerably less price than what it would cost to build it closer to home. But as we know, the problem of sweatshop and unsafe working conditions becomes a factor, because in less developed countries, everything is different. The economy is different, the culture is different, and what constitutes a good job by our standards may look very different from those working in these other countries. So there's sweatshops, there's often unsafe working conditions, and there is also in our next block what we call modern day slavery. And we see that come into the supply chain when some type of product or industry needs to be augmented in terms of manpower, and migrants are brought in from another country, and that's used to help production. But of course, we have a human rights abuse now, so that leads to negative publicity to just about everybody in that supply chain, but certainly the retailer or the business or brand that is trying to sell that product. Those of you that work in supply chain management, you know this already, and it puts a lot of pressure on you. So just a little bit more background. Prior to the 1980s, and I mentioned this earlier, we had the vertical integration model. And if a company did not own its own production, it would outsource it often on a domestic basis, in other words, within the home country. But a really big outsourcing boom started in the 1980s. Of course, retail discount chains such as Walmart were leading that business model, and it put a lot of pressure on businesses everywhere to lower their cost because people were really price shopping on certain items. And of course, that was food and retail. So finally, that competition for price pushes the retailers and the brands to find some way to cut their costs because they're facing the threat of having their customers move elsewhere in terms of shopping if they are not price competitive. So at the home front, we see domestic jobs that are lost, and we see outsourcing going to less developed countries, and of course, the introduction of sweatshops and possibly slavery. So I want to take this discussion and explain a little bit how the slavery actually emerges into the supply chain. And with my cursor, I'm going to begin by looking at this business right here. And we'll say this is just a domestic business of some type. And I'll say, let's suppose it's a clothing business. It's a brand. And in clothing, we often use the word brand or business or retail. So if I say brand or business, I'm referring to, a clothing brand of some type. And if we look at these two suppliers here, we'll call this the tier 1 suppliers. These are the ones that are actually making the final product. They're assembling that product. Back at tier 2, we have the components being made. This would be where the cloth and the zippers and buttons are made. And then tier 3 would be more of the farming and agricultural or raw material stage of where the products come from. So we see we've got our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And then I've drawn a country border going across the bottom here. And let's start with this area here, the prospective worker. Now, prospective workers, migrants in particular, they move from one country to another because they are desperate to find work. It may be that the country they're in is a failed country of some type that can't provide for its citizens, and at a minimum, it can't provide jobs for local citizens to be able to work. The people most affected, though, are poor workers that have few job skills. And what happens is that worker will often live in a village, and a labor agent will come recruiting to that village and promise that worker, and it's usually a group of workers, a chance to make money in another country. And oftentimes the promise is made that if you let me, I will transport you to another country. I'll introduce you to another person who will help you find, that sort of dream job. A factory job is usually what is promised, and in that factory job, it'll pay well, and you can begin to send money back to your family to support them. So the model begins, I say model because this is a typical way it happens. That prospective worker gets with that first labor agent, and the labor agent is going to charge them a fee to provide that service of moving them over to the next country. Now, that fee is high, and the labor agent knows that this worker cannot pay it. So they set up a credit system where they say, okay, you can pay me back, but I'm going to go ahead and start the process. So the worker is moved to another country, and this is often done illegally at night and under extreme conditions of danger. For example, some of you might have heard that in England this week, there was a truck that had 39 bodies in it. What was happening there was exactly what we're talking about here. There was an effort to move people to England where they could find a job, and it was nothing more than human trafficking. So once that worker is in the new country, a second labor agent will move them somewhere to a job in the supply chain. And that second labor agent is going to charge a fee as well. And in essence, the second labor agent will buy the debt of the first labor agent. And then that second labor agent will sell the worker to a business somewhere in the supply chain. The business will buy that debt. Both labor agents will have their money. And now the business will say, we're going to let you work off your debt with us. And this is where the accounting systems aren't going to be very ethical, because some workers may end up there for years under harsh conditions and not see their debt moved very much at all. The options would be to move the worker deep into the supply chain where they can kind of be hidden from monitoring. It would be risky to put a worker into a tier 1 supplier, because these are often monitored by this business over here. So tier 1 is usually not going to be where a slave ends up. However, you see I've got something here called a shadow factory. A shadow factory may also do the same functions as a tier 1 supplier, but it is not really an official supplier. For example, some of you are familiar with the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh back 2013, something like that, where over 1,100 people died. In that factory, there were about 4 smaller factories making clothing. And what had happened was one of the suppliers in this area contracted out for work to be done in one of the factories at Rana Plaza. And this was done without the knowledge of the main brand back in the domestic market. So the shadow factory, officially, it's not part of this contractual arrangement. The business back here doesn't know about it, but they are helping to augment the capacity of one of these suppliers here. And it turns out Rana Plaza had several shadow factories going on. Now, Rana Plaza did not have slavery, but I'm using them as an example to show what a shadow factory would be and how somebody could end up in a situation like that at the tier 1 level, but not within the monitoring level. Okay, one resource that came out a few years ago, actually 2009, I believe, was a book by Ellen Shell, and she does a good job of explaining how the discount industry runs. And there was one quote in there that's kind of stuck with me for a while. When competition is mostly about price, innovation too often takes a backseat to cost cutting. Laying off workers and hiring cheaper ones is one sure way to enhance the bottom line. Another is to scour the world for low-wage workers, especially those in countries with lackluster enforcement of environmental and worker rights regulations. Now, I tell my students in my business strategy course, I say, look, you're a business student. I'm teaching a business class, but at some point, we may sound like we're a social work class, because we've got to understand some of these issues going on. And it doesn't matter if somebody leans to the left or to the right politically. The reality is in discount retail, the worker right thing can come back to haunt a company or a brand. So let's look at why it's important to know this area, what we'll say is beyond tier 1. There's a term that we sometimes use in supply chain management called opaqueness, and this just means you can't see it very well. And in regards to a supply chain, we're saying that, at tier 2 and beyond, we don't often have the visibility that we would like to have. And I often tell my students, the more to the left that your supply chain is going, in other words, if your supply chain has tiers 2 and 3 and 4 to the left, I say the more to the left your supply chain extends, the more risk is involved. Because in these less visible tiers, you have environmental sustainability problems, you have worker rights abuses, and one thing I don't mention much in this presentation, but we have to accept the reality that quality control may be very well an issue too. So if we take another look at the supply chain, and this time I've got it looking like it's more of a fashion example. We'll say our retail stores are the final consumers, and we'll put a brand right here. It could be J.C. Penney's or H&M or any clothing brand, and realize the clothing companies have brands underneath them, so I sometimes use brands and retailers interchangeably. But feeding the brands is at tier 1, we've got final assembly, and final assembly is the sewing part of the job. In the clothing industry, there is still not a very high-tech way of making clothing. You still have to have a sewing machine and somebody to put those parts together. At tier 2, you have the components going into the clothing, and this would be the cloth and zippers and so forth. And then at tier 3, we've got our raw material stage. Now, when we introduce this concept of opaqueness, we start to see, or maybe I should say, we don't see what is going on at the very edge of our supply chain, particularly in tier 2 and 3. And at this point, there are literally hundreds of companies that are feeding our tier 1 suppliers, which are feeding our brand. And if you're in supply chain management at the brand level, you may have a good grasp on what's going on at your tier 1 suppliers, but those outside at tier 2 and tier 3, they are less visible, and hence we use the word opaque. So 3 concepts have emerged to help address the problem. 1 is monitoring, 2 is transparency, and 3 is traceability. Now, monitoring is typically done by the brand to look at the standards being set by their tier 1 suppliers. And this is usually tier 1s are scrutinized a lot through visits and inspections and audits of the supplier. So this is a standard practice used in many companies. Transparency is more an attempt to get the supply chain at least mapped out in a way where you can see the raw materials all the way through to the final assembly. So we sometimes get that concept of supply chain mapping comes out when we talk about transparency. And then traceability is trying to get the batch or the shipment or the crate or whatever it is that product is in, trying to be able to track it from the particular farm or factory or assembly line that it came from. In other words, we try to trace it back to its original source. And you can see in the food industry, this could become terribly important if we have an outbreak of a food-related disease or sickness. So back to monitoring for a second, the main problem with monitoring is it's focused mainly on tier 1. And also, there are problems ensuring that the audits are actually effective and done in a way that's consistent from one factory to another. With transparency, we're getting into mapping the supply chain, but it kind of stops there. We're it's what we call a good first step, but it's not the complete answer. And traceability, there is a lot of potential in this area because this is where we can really get to the micro unit of production and see actual sources and so forth. So traceability has a lot of potential there. So as many of you out there know, you're under a lot of pressure. You're being told to buy products and keep the cost within some type of standard that's been set by your company. But you've got stakeholders out there, and we sometimes call them social stakeholders, who put pressure on your company to keep that supply chain ethically sound, environmentally friendly, and free of human rights abuses. And of course, all the while threatening to move their purchasing elsewhere if the price of the product becomes too high. And in clothing, this is kind of interesting because there are some experimental or laboratory settings where they do studies and ask people, well, if you bought clothing from a company that said the supply chain was completely free of environmental or human rights abuses, would you be willing to pay more? And a lot of people in a situation that's experimental will say yes. But if you look at the actual purchasing that goes on a day-to-day basis, sometimes the facts speak elsewhere. So a lot of pressure, obviously working in supply chain management. So a few summary comments here. Globalization has moved those supply chains as far out as they can get, and pressure is on to keep unit cost as low as possible, and many of you are in the middle of that, and with the idea that savings have to be passed on to the customer in the form of lower purchase prices. Otherwise, for example, that clothing brand may not survive if they can't keep the prices where the customers want them. So fast fashion is a sub area of the fashion industry, but it's an industry where styles change not seasonally, but several times a year. And this creates a number of buying scenarios, great for consumers, particularly if they're looking for bargain prices and don't want to wear those clothes too long, but can be tough for those who work in the garment industry. So the problem, of course, clothing brands, and I'm just talking about clothing, but lots of industries that source to less developed countries do lose control over those working conditions. And we're talking about tier 2, tier 3, and of course, tier 1 as well. So a little bit of a summary here on just the fashion industry. And I'm just using this as an example now, but I've mentioned that at the tier 1 level, and this is the level where factories are typically monitored by their brand, but this is the final assembly of the product. At tier 2, which is less visible, you've got the making of the cloth, the processes that are involved there. And not only is there probability of labor abuse occurring, but environmental abuse too, because of the number of chemicals and water usage. And then tier 3, back to the raw material stages. These are less visible in our supply chains. So if we take that picture or figure we had earlier and we add the element of opaqueness, we end up with a situation like this. And we'll say that this line here is the international border. this area over here tends to reside with suppliers that are in countries with less developed, or they're in less developed countries. And so it is this area where the slavery is likely to occur. Okay, so a couple summary comments. At tier 1, this is the tier that is monitored the most, and visibility hopefully is as good as it's going to be at tier 1. But even auditing a plant is not always perfect. There's certainly, as you know, many problems that can exist as far as deceiving the auditor. Unauthorized subcontracting is a common practice that can occur, especially in the clothing industry. And I've given the example of the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. So for the sake of time, you'll have this in your slide. I'm going to move to the next item about tier 1. And that is, need to be aware at least that although a lot of monitoring occurs at tier 1, the record of success at keeping those factories exactly where the brand wants them is kind of hit and miss. So we provide some articles in the back in case you're interested in looking at that closer. Now at tier 2, we begin to see this opaqueness, and this is where it's harder to monitor that supplier, it's harder to see them, and as a result, it can be easier to hide slavery. At tier 2, we know that the number of businesses is increasing quite a bit because they're sub-suppliers to tier 1. So these numbers are going up. The ability to monitor tier 2 is definitely difficult for that brand or retailer. And one of the aspirations or hopes that retailers have is that their tier 1 suppliers will monitor their tier 2 suppliers. But when you're talking about a less developed country that is desperate for the business, this monitoring obviously can take on a wide array of quality. So very difficult situation, assuming that if tier 1 monitors tier 2, everything will be fine. Just doesn't quite work that way. So with opaqueness, or that inability to see those suppliers at tier 2, those of you that are back at the domestic location are at a disadvantage. Do you really know what's going on there? Some of you might, and that's great, but a lot of people in supply chain management would have to say no, we're not really comfortable with everything, or at least knowledgeable of everything that goes on. At tier 3, you can see this is the most elusive in terms of being able to see what's going on, and we're back into the raw material stage now. So for the interest of time, and I'm going to move over to the recommendations, and again the slides will be available to everybody, but I'm pushing my limit here on the time. Let me go over a couple things that we do see going on. First of all, publicly disclosing tier 1 suppliers is becoming a best practice, particularly with some of our large multinational corporations. And again, tier 1 is not where the slavery is typically going to reside, but it is a way to begin that first step towards full transparency of a supply chain. Now, Nike has their tier 1 suppliers listed. They also have Google Maps showing the location and the outside conditions of their suppliers. There are several companies doing this right now, and typically you can download a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and you'll get a long list of suppliers. Now, full supply chain disclosure, knowing everything from tier 2, tier 3 and beyond, we're just not there yet in terms of being able to do that in a cost-effective manner. But a lot of analysts feel like the question is not can it be done, but when that will be achievable, because there are some technologies and some movements afoot that are actually seeking to get 100% transparency of supply chains. And of course, the idea is once you're there, then you're able to better detect and identify if there's a human rights abuse or a slavery abuse or something of that nature. So in terms of industries out there, there's a small industry emerging where companies as well as non-government organizations, we call them NGOs, are working to help businesses identify every tier of their supply chain and every supplier within that supply chain. And of course, you think about that, you could be talking literally hundreds, maybe thousands of suppliers. That's the scope of this. But that seems to be where our supply chain management scrutiny is going. So in terms of how that is going to look, right now we're sort of in an in-between stage where the aspiration is there, but the technology and the ability to do it is not quite ready. There are some examples where blockchain technology can enable more transparency of the supply chain. There are companies that use sort of a social networking platform where each company agrees to reveal its suppliers and it sort of has a cascading effect. But in terms of, is it readily available to do that on an easy scale? Not at the moment. But with the pressure on companies to keep their supply chains free, this industry is going to be one to watch with some degree of excitement. So we've got a few seconds left here. Kind of give a short list of the kind of things that we hear over and over again when we're researching this area of supply chain management, particularly as it relates to slavery. And the first thing that always comes up is having the ability to map the supply chain. And I know you've heard that before, but we still kind of go back to the basics. The more you can map and identify your supply chain, the better able you'll be able to control it. Now, partnering with non-government organizations is a second promise there. Now, there are NGOs out there that are not business friendly, but there are many that are. And there are some that are very committed to helping you with your supply chain. I'll give you a list of those in a minute. Number 3, nothing that you haven't seen already, implementing codes of conduct for your suppliers. Now, when we say suppliers, we're of course talking about our tier 1. But I mentioned the aspiration is that they will force their suppliers to do the same, but don't count on that when you're working in a less developed country. I think we all know that that's a tremendous amount of difference in culture and how things work when you're dealing with a less developed country. Of course, auditing tier 1 plants, we still recommend that. But in terms of if this information is available, avoiding plants that receive mass migrants, that's a red flag. And if those migrants are paying a labor fee, that's a red flag, particularly the labor fee thing, because that points in the direction of a possible forced labor situation. And be aware that there are a few companies, not very many, that are beginning to list their tier ones. A couple resources I have here for you. Again, these links will work when you are in slideshow mode, but these four here are ones that are working specifically to help companies identify tier two and beyond. Source map is an interesting one. It is actually um, quite a bit of coverage on source map, so that might be a good starting point because there's some free applications you can use there just to kind of get your feet wet. Companies that have found slavery in their supply chain, you probably recognize all of them except maybe the second one. The Metals Group is actually an Australian company founded by or led by Andrew Forrest, and he was is the CEO, president, found slavery in the supply chain, and what he did was from that experience, he created an NGO that is there just to address this problem and help companies clean up their supply chain. So you can see I've got links to all of these, and I think you'll find them pretty interesting. One thing I would highly recommend, this link right here. This is an investigation into the shrimp supply chain in Thailand and how slavery entered that one. Okay, a couple NGOs that are working to be business friendly and help them are listed here. And for those of you in California, you're already aware of the California Transparency Act, but this little PDF right here, good resource for just some best practices, no matter what part of the country you're in. If you've got a little time, International Labor Organization has an extensive website with some good information on slavery there. And then finally, got some various examples of companies and what they're doing in terms of their traceability efforts. A few articles here in the back and so forth. So with the time I've got, I think that wraps up what I'm able to say at this point. And Kim, I will turn it back over to you.
Well, thanks, Rick. Now we've saved some time for questions and answers. And as a reminder, look at the right toolbar on your screen and type your question in the questions box and click send. And we'll give you a few moments to send in your questions. I know we've got a few that have come through. One of them, Rick, we've got is we hear a lot about discount retailers having issues with sweatshops and slavery in their supply chains. And why is that the case?
The main reason is it's an industry where the consumers are very price sensitive. And if they can, say, if they're shopping for a product and they have multiple venues where they can buy what looks like to them the same product at different locations, they'll pick the one that has the lowest price. So of course it's easy to shop online first and do that, but if it's a big appliance, you can still end up at the big box retailer. But with internet, we can certainly price shop very accordingly, and that pressure is there for retailers and the brands to just keep bringing their prices lower, because consumers are thinking in their minds, if that product is essentially the same product from one location to another, then intuitively it makes sense to buy it where you can get the best price for it. That puts pressure on the retailers to keep driving their per unit costs down, and that means or could mean sourcing to a less developed country in the making of the final product. So it's a tremendous amount of pressure being put on that business, both from the consumer and just from the competition in general.
And I know you touched on this, but we have someone asking, what are possible ways of increasing the transparency in the supply chain beyond the tier one?
Right. The two methods that we're seeing, actually there's a couple methods that sort of overlap with each other, but one is just simply asking your tier one suppliers to list out their tier one suppliers, which are your tier two suppliers. And, there's really not any shortcuts there, but it's a tedious process of just getting in there and asking each tier of the supply chain to share what who their suppliers are at each of their tiers. So there's a couple of companies that I mentioned, and do I still have control of the slides, Kim?
Yes.
Okay. These companies right here are attempting to do that through, I kind of call it a social networking platform, where by getting the information from each supplier and aggregating it in a way where it becomes visible to everybody involved, there's an exchange of information, and they're encouraging just more transparency by getting people signed up into their platform and building a sort of a big database of suppliers. So it's not a huge shortcut, and some of these companies make big claims as far as what they tell you they can do, but once you get in there, it's still a lot of work that has to be done, and it's only going to be as good as the willingness of that tiered supplier who's in that opaque region. It's their willingness to share. How much do they want to share about themselves? So if they're not willing to share, then there's efforts to try to identify companies that are not as forthcoming and coming up with their red list as well. But again, the main driver of these kind of companies is sort of a social platform approach. On the other side, of course, there's the blockchain approach, which a lot of work still needs to be done there as far as making that something that's readily doable and attainable for a large number of businesses. That's why I say we're kind of at that in-between stage right now, Kim, where companies aren't there yet in terms of seeing full supply chain disclosure and clearing that opaqueness. But clearing the opaqueness is a first step in finding those practices such as slavery and environmental problems that need to be identified. So, as supply chain managers, we can make better decisions.
So, and Rick, why is it that migrants seem to be the people who are the most prone to end up as these slaves?
What happens with a migrant is their work is augmenting the capacity for some element of an industry that needs the workers. Now, let me give you an example of that. Shrimp from Thailand. It's a long and complicated supply chain, but one of the key elements where it's hard to get workers is on the fishing boats, and these fishing boats are not catching the shrimp, they're catching the fish that are used to become feed for the shrimp that's being grown on a farm. So you got to feed the shrimp something, and it's usually some derivative of what we call a trash fish. Just you take that fish and you grind it up and you turn it into a mealy substance, and then you feed that to the shrimp. So we're at the very back of the supply chain on a fishing boat that's catching that fish. And the fishermen are the ones who are tending to be migrants because it's a job that nobody wants. There's a boat captain, and then there's a boat full of fishermen. It's a hard job. It's a job where some of these boats stay out for months at a time. And it's not a job that the people, the local Thais or the local citizens of Thailand would want to do. So, to augment the need for those workers, human traffickers bring migrants over from Laos and Cambodia, and they trick them into thinking they're going to be working in a factory, but they may end up on a fishing boat instead. And the reason the migrant is so susceptible is they are desperate to find work. They're desperate to provide for their family. They're at their wits' end. There's nothing else for them to do. And if somebody is fleeing their country to find work, they're in a desperate situation, but they're also highly vulnerable for becoming a slave. So once they get to the country, they don't know the language, they don't know the legal system. Their passport or visa is often taken from them, so they can't move physically around very far. And they're easy bait for some labor agent to put them, on a fishing boat.
Well, we have time for one more question. Do you think there'll ever be a day when it's possible to see the entire supply chain from raw materials to the consumer?
Yeah, I think that day is coming. I can't say exactly when that will be, and I can't say if it'll be sooner rather than later, but there's an industry out there that is working on that right now. And social stakeholders and our customers absolutely are demanding that our supply chains be free of these types of abuses. So for the supply chain practitioner out there, the need is there for some type of technology, and I think the answer will come from technology as opposed to government regulation. I think there'll be some technology disruptors that will help give the tools to our supply chain professionals, the tools they need to get that full visibility. But right now, we're at the cusp of seeing what that's going to be, and I think the next 5 to 10 years could be pretty exciting as far as what may develop.
Well, thanks, Rick. That's all the time we have today for the questions. And I'd like to thank Rick and all of the participants for their time today. And this concludes today's edition of SCM Live. Thank you for joining us. All the content and materials included in this edition of SCM Live are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.